One of the things Alex and Connor looked forward to the most when they were young had been the trips to see their grandmother. She lived up in the mountains in the heart of the woods in a tiny house that could be best described as a cottage, if such a thing still existed. It was a long journey, a few hours by car, but the twins loved every minute of it. Their anticipation would grow as they traveled up the windy roads and through the endless trees, and when they crossed the yellow bridge, the twins would excitedly exclaim, "We're almost there! We're almost there!" Once they arrived, their grandmother would greet them at the door with open arms and hugs so tight they would almost pop. "Look at you two! You have both grown a foot since the last time I saw you," Grandma would say, even if they hadn't, and then would lead them inside where a freshly baked batch of cookies waited for them. Their father had grown up in the woods and would spend hours each day telling the twins his adventures as a kid. All the trees he had climbed, all the streams he had swum, and all the ferocious animals he had barely escaped from. Most of his retellings were highly exaggerated, but they loved this time with him more than anything else in the world. "Someday, when you're older, I'll take you to all the secret places where I used to play," their father would tease them. He was a tall man with kind eyes that would wrinkle whenever he smiled, and he smiled quite a bit, especially when he was teasing the twins. At night, the twins' mother would help their grandmother cook dinner, and after they had eaten, as soon as the dishes were done, the family would sit around the fireplace. Their grandmother would open a big storybook, and she and her father would take turns reading the twins fairy tales until they fell asleep. Sometimes the Bailey family would be up until sunrise. They told the stories with such detail and passion that it didn't matter how many times the twins heard the same story. They were the best memories any child could ask for. Unfortunately, the twins hadn't been back to the grandmother's cottage in a very long time. "Mr. Bailey!" Mrs. Peters shouted. Connor had dozed off again. "Sorry, Mrs. Peters," he bellowed back, sitting straight up in his seat like a soldier on guard. If looks could kill, Connor would have been dead from the scowl she was sending him. "What did we think of the real Little Red Riding Hood?" the teacher asked her class. A girl with frizzy hair and thick braces raised her hand. "Mrs. Peters?" the frizzy-haired girl asked. "I'm confused." "And why is that?" Mrs. Peters said, as if asking, "What on earth could possibly confused about, idiot?" "Because it says that the big bad wolf is killed by the hunter," the frizzy-haired girl explained. "I always thought the wolf was just upset because the other wolves in his pack made fun of his snout, and he and Little Red Riding Hood became friends in the end. At least that's what happened in the cartoon I used to watch when I was little." Mrs. Peters rolled her eyes so far into the back of her head she could have seen what was behind her. "That," she said with a clenched jaw, "is exactly why we're having this lesson." The frizzy-haired girl became wide-eyed and sad. How could something so dear to her have been so wrong? "For homework," Mrs. Peters said, and the room unanimously slumped in their seats. "You are to pick your favorite fairy tale and write a paper due tomorrow on the real lesson the tale is trying to teach us." Mrs. Peters went to her desk and the students began working on their assignment with the little class time remaining. "Mr. Bailey," Mrs. Peters summoned Connor to her desk. "A word, please." Connor was in deep trouble, and he knew it. He cautiously stood up and walked to Mrs. Peters' desk. The other students gave him sorrowful looks as he walked by, as if he were walking to his executioner. "Yes, Mrs. Peters?" Connor asked. "Connor, I've been trying to be very sensitive about your family situation," Mrs. Peters said, glaring at him over the frames of her glasses. Family situation. Two words Connor had heard too many times in the last year. "However," Mrs. Peters continued, "there's certain behavior I just will not tolerate in my classroom. You're constantly falling asleep in class. You don't pay attention, not to mention your quiz and test very poorly. Your sister seems to be functioning just fine. Perhaps you could follow her example." It was a comparison that felt like a kick in the stomach every time someone made it. Indeed, Connor was not his sister by any means, and he was always punished because of it. "If this continues, I will be forced to have a meeting with your mother. Do you understand?" Mrs. Peters warned him. "Yes, sir. I mean, ma'am. I meant, ma'am. Sorry." It just hadn't been his best day. Okay then, you may have a seat. Connor slowly walked back to his seat, his head hanging slightly lower than it had all day. More than anything, he hated feeling like a failure. Alex had watched the entire conversation between her brother and their teacher. As much as her brother embarrassed her, she did feel for him as only a sister could. Alex flipped through his literature book, deciding on which story to write about. The pictures weren't as colorful and exciting as they had been in her grandmother's book, but seeing all the characters she had grown up reading about made her feel at home, a feeling that had recently become a rarity. If only fairy tales were real, she thought. Someone could wave a wand and magically make things how they used to be.